Hitsville Studio A, Detroit, Michigan, February 1968. The air inside the booth was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. David Ruffin stood at the microphone, headphones draped around his neck like a trophy, his silk shirt unbuttoned just enough to show confidence that bordered on arrogance. He had just finished a take of Ain't Too Proud to Beg, and the engineers were nodding approval through the glass. Ruffin was on fire, and he knew it. "I got the highest voice in Motown," he said to no one in particular, though everyone was listening. "Nobody up here can touch me where I go." One of the session musicians, a guitarist who'd played on half of Motown's hits, glanced up from tuning his instrument. "What about Marvin?" Ruffin laughed. Not a friendly laugh, the kind of laugh that dismisses someone before they even enter the room. Marvin's a baritone. He stays low, safe. That's his lane." The engineer leaned into the talkback mic. "Marvin's got range, David. You know that." "Range is one thing," Ruffin said, walking out of the booth and into the control room. "Power is another. And up there?" He pointed toward the ceiling as if heaven itself was his exclusive territory. "Up there, I'm the king." That's when the door opened. Marvin Gaye walked in carrying a cup of coffee and a folder of sheet music. He wasn't supposed to be there that day. His session wasn't until later. But Motown was like that. Artists wandered in and out of each other's sessions, sometimes to collaborate, sometimes just to escape whatever was happening outside those walls. Ruffin turned. "Speak of the devil. Marvin, they saying you can hit my notes." Marvin set his coffee down on the console carefully, like he was buying himself a moment to decide whether to engage. "I don't try to hit your notes, David. That's because you can't." The room shifted. The session musicians looked at each other. The engineer adjusted knobs that didn't need adjusting. Everyone knew where this was going. Marvin could have walked away. He should have. He had nothing to prove. Not to David Ruffin, not to anyone in that building. But something in Ruffin's tone, something in the way he stood there with his arms crossed and that smile playing at the corner of his mouth, landed wrong. It wasn't just a challenge, it was dismissal. And Marvin had been dismissed his whole life, by his father, by Berry Gordy in the early years, by critics who said he was too soft, too polished, too Motown to be real soul. "Tell you what," Ruffin said, sensing weakness. "Ain't Too Proud to Beg. The final note, I'll hit it, you try to match it. If you can, I'll buy you that Corvette you've been eyeing in the lot. If you can't, you admit I'm the best voice at Motown." Marvin looked at him for a long time. "I don't need to prove anything, David." That's what scared people always say. There it was, the word that made the decision. Scared. Marvin felt something tighten in his chest. He thought about his father, standing in the pulpit on Sunday mornings, preaching about courage and faith while beating his children behind closed doors. He thought about all the times he'd been told he wasn't man enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't enough, period. And he thought about Tammy Terrell, who had looked at him just weeks before she died and said, "You're always hiding, Marvin, even when you're singing." Maybe she was right. Maybe he had been hiding, playing it safe, staying in his lane, being the Motown prince who never colored outside the lines. But standing there in that control room, with David Ruffin's challenge hanging in the air, and everyone watching to see if he would accept or retreat, Marvin felt something shift inside him. It wasn't courage. It was something closer to resignation. The kind of feeling you get when you realize there's no point in protecting something that's already broken. When you understand that hiding doesn't save you, it just delays the inevitable moment when everyone sees what you really are. Marvin nodded slowly. "Fine." Ruffin grinned and clapped his hands together once. Sharp. "All right then, let's do this." The engineer rewound the tape to the final section of Ain't Too Proud to Beg. The Funk Brothers had laid down the track earlier that week. Bass pumping, horns tight, drums driving. It was a song built for vocal acrobatics, and the ending was a showcase, a moment where the singer could launch into the stratosphere and prove they had something divine in their throat. Ruffin stepped back into the booth. He rolled his shoulders, stretched his neck, did the small rituals performers do before they reach for something extreme. The track started. He sang through the verses casually, saving his energy. And then the moment came. The music dropped out for just a beat, and Ruffin took a breath so deep you could see his chest expand. Please, don't leave me, girl. The note shot upward, clear and piercing, held for 4 seconds that felt like an eternity. It was technically perfect. No wobble, no strain. Pure power. When he came down, the room erupted. The session musicians clapped. The engineer whistled. Ruffin came out of the booth grinning, arms spread wide like a prize fighter who just landed a knockout. Beat that, he said, looking directly at Marvin. Marvin stood up slowly. He didn't say anything. He just walked to the booth, closed the door behind him, and put on the headphones. The engineer reset the tape. For a moment before the music started, Marvin stood completely still. His eyes were closed. His hands hung loose at his sides. He looked like a man preparing for something that had nothing to do with competition. In the darkness behind his closed eyes, Marvin wasn't thinking about David Ruffin or the challenge. He was thinking about Tammy, about the way she collapsed in his arms on that stage in Virginia, about visiting her in the hospital, holding her hand while she struggled to remember his name. He thought about the recording sessions they'd done together, how easy it had been to sing with her because she understood that the songs weren't performances. They were confessions. Every love song they sang was about the love they were searching for but couldn't find. And now Tammy was gone. And Marvin was standing in a booth about to sing for all the wrong reasons. Not because he loved the music, but because someone had called him scared and he was too tired to walk away. The engineer's voice came through the headphones. Ready when you are, Marvin. Marvin opened his eyes. He looked through the glass at David Ruffin, standing there confident and waiting. And Marvin realized something. David wanted to win. Marvin just wanted to feel something. Anything. Even if it was pain. Because pain was the only thing that felt real anymore. Everything else, the success, the applause, the Motown machine, felt like theater. But pain was honest. Pain couldn't lie. The track started. Marvin sang the verses and they were fine. Good even, but nothing special. He stayed in his range, his voice smooth and controlled, the way Motown had trained him to sing. Safe, precise, professional. And then the final moment arrived. Marvin took a breath. What came out of him wasn't a note. It was something else. Something that sounded like it had been buried so deep inside that pulling it up hurt. Please, don't leave me, girl. Same words, same pitch. But where Ruffin's note was a declaration of power, Marvin's was a plea for mercy. Where Ruffin celebrated his ability, Marvin confessed his need. The note climbed and climbed, but it wasn't clean. It cracked in the middle. It wavered. It sounded like a man on the edge of breaking, but he held it. 6 seconds, 7, 8. When he finally let it go, the room was silent. Marvin took off the headphones and walked out of the booth. He didn't look at anyone. He picked up his coffee, which had gone cold, and stood by the wall. Ruffin hadn't moved. He was staring at the floor. The engineer finally spoke. I don't even know what that was. One of the musicians, an older man who'd been playing Motown sessions since the beginning, shook his head slowly. That wasn't singing. What was it then? The engineer asked. That was bleeding. Ruffin looked up at Marvin. You hit it. Marvin nodded. But it didn't sound like me. No, Marvin said quietly. It didn't. It sounded like... Ruffin trailed off, searching for the word. It sounded like pain. Marvin didn't respond. What was there to say? He had won. He had matched the note, maybe even exceeded it. But the victory felt hollow, because Ruffin was right. What Marvin had done in that booth wasn't a technical achievement. It was exposure. He had pulled something out of himself that he usually kept hidden, and now everyone in the room had heard it. Ruffin left shortly after. He shook hands with the engineers, made some excuse about needing to be somewhere, and walked out. But those who knew him could see it. Something had shifted. The swagger was gone. In the parking lot, Ruffin sat in his car for 20 minutes, staring at nothing. He kept replaying what had just happened. Not the technical details, but the feeling. The way Marvin's voice had sounded like a man confessing something he'd been trying to hide his entire life. David Ruffin had always believed that singing was about power, about dominating a room, but Marvin hadn't dominated anything. He had surrendered, and somehow that surrender was more powerful than anything Ruffin could manufacture. Over the next few weeks, stories started circulating around Motown. David Ruffin was causing problems with the Temptations. He was showing up late to rehearsals. He was demanding his name be billed above the group. He was fighting with everyone. But what people didn't talk about was the drinking, or the nights Ruffin would sit alone, listening to Marvin's records, trying to understand what he was missing, or the way he started pushing himself in rehearsals, reaching for higher notes, trying to add that same raw quality to his voice. But it never worked. Because you can't fake pain. By the end of the year, he was gone, fired from the group he had helped make legendary. People said it was ego. They said Ruffin couldn't handle being part of an ensemble anymore, that he thought he was bigger than the Temptations. And maybe that was part of it. But there were those who remembered that day in Hitsville Studio A. They remembered the challenge, the note, the silence afterward. They remembered the look on Ruffin's face when Marvin walked out of the booth. Years later, in 1991, David Ruffin gave an interview to a music journalist. They talked about his time with the Temptations, about his solo career, about his struggles with addiction. And toward the end, the journalist asked him about Marvin Gaye. "You two were friends, right?" Ruffin nodded. "We were." "What was he like?" Ruffin was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You know that day in the studio, when we did the note thing? I heard about that. You challenged him to hit your high note." "Yeah, and he did it. But that night I went home and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept replaying it in my head. And I realized something." "What's that?" "Marvin didn't beat me with technique. He beat me because he hurt more than I did. His pain was bigger. And when you're a singer, when you're trying to move people, pain is the only thing that matters. You can have all the range in the world. You can hit every note perfectly. But if you don't have pain, you got nothing." The journalist pressed. "So that changed things for you?" Ruffin looked out the window. "It changed everything. Because I realized I'd been singing to impress. Marvin was singing because he had to. I was an entertainer. He was exercising demons. And I knew right then, I'll never be that real. I'll never hurt that much. So what was the point of staying?" "That's why you left the Temptations?" "That's why I left everything. Because Marvin showed me the difference between being good and being true. And I wasn't built for true." The interview ended shortly after. David Ruffin died 3 months later, found in a hospital in Philadelphia, his body ravaged by cocaine and years of living on the edge. When Marvin heard the news, he was in Los Angeles, working on what would become his final album. Someone called him, gave him the details, asked if he wanted to make a statement. Marvin hung up the phone without saying anything. He sat alone in his room for hours. He didn't cry. He didn't call anyone. He just sat there, replaying that day in 1968, hearing David's voice, hearing his own. The memories came in fragments. David's face when he walked out of the booth. The way the room had gone silent. The feeling of having won something he never wanted to win in the first place. In the years after that challenge, Marvin had watched David's career spiral, and Marvin had wanted to say something, wanted to tell David that the challenge didn't matter, but he never did, because deep down, Marvin knew it had mattered. It had shown David something he couldn't unsee, and it had shown Marvin something too, that the only way he knew how to sing was to bleed. Now David was dead, another Motown voice silenced, another man who couldn't figure out how to live in a world that demanded perfection while crushing anyone who tried to achieve it. Later that night, a friend stopped by. They found Marvin still sitting in the same spot. "You okay?" Marvin looked up. His eyes were dry but distant. "I broke him." "What?" "David, I broke him. That day in the studio. I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to. But I did." "Marvin, that was over 20 years ago. David made his own choices. He made choices because of what I showed him. I showed him that singing wasn't about talent, it was about damage. And he couldn't live with that. That's not your fault." Marvin shook his head slowly. "I won that challenge. I hit the note. Everyone said I was better. But what did I win? I proved I could reach higher because I fell further. That's not victory, that's just evidence." The friend didn't know what to say. Marvin stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the city lights stretching into the distance. You know what the worst part is? I still do it. Every time I sing, I reach for that place, the place where the pain lives. And every time, it takes something from me. But I can't stop, because now people expect it. They expect me to bleed, and if I don't, they'll say I'm not being real. He turned back. David saw that. He saw what singing like that costs, and he decided it wasn't worth it. Maybe he was right. The friend left shortly after, and Marvin sat alone again, thinking about all the moments where he'd been asked to prove himself. And every time he proved himself, it cost him something. A piece of privacy, a piece of protection. That challenge with David wasn't just about a note. It was about whether Marvin was willing to expose his wounds for entertainment. And he had been willing. He had shown everyone in that room exactly how broken he was. And they had loved him for it. But every time Marvin reached into that dark place and pulled something out, he couldn't put it back. The wound stayed open. David had seen that, and David had walked away. Marvin had stayed. And every year since, he had been proving the same thing, that he could hurt more than anyone else. But power like that doesn't save you. It just makes your destruction more spectacular. 2 years later, on April 1st, 1984, Marvin Gaye was shot and killed by his father in the house they shared on Gramercy Place. He was one day away from his 45th birthday. When the news broke, people remembered his music. What's going on? Let's get it on. Sexual healing. They remembered his influence, his activism, his place in history. But there were a few people, scattered across the country, who remembered a different moment, a challenge in a Detroit studio. A note that proved nothing except that some people are built to reach higher because they've fallen further. And they wondered, in the quiet of their own thoughts, whether winning that challenge had been the beginning of the end, whether proving he could hurt more than anyone else had locked Marvin into a performance he could never escape. David Ruffin had walked away from the stage. Marvin Gaye had stayed, and in the end, staying had cost him everything.